in which he said that what was perhaps was required at this point, and I'm not endorsing this or for or against, but he said that perhaps what we needed was a kind of an Islamic Reformation and a Muslim Luther, which is an interesting concept. It's something for you to think about, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But in the interim...
Could I just say that Al-Ghazali was a philosopher before he was a Sufi. He was a student of Greek philosophy, and then he became a Sufi. And he really followed very much the same career path as Augustine, who was also enamored of Greek philosophy and then turned his back on it.
Great, thank you.
But Christianity recovered from that, and Islam hasn't.
All right, so let's hear Lawrence Krauss.
Okay, good. When Roger asked me last night to speak after Steve, I knew I wouldn't be able to compete in ideas, so I decided I'd have pictures. I wasn't quite sure what Steve would talk about, but I do want to talk about the conflict between science and religion and argue that that by focusing on this conflict, that scientists not only demean religion, which I think is the intent of a number of them, but demean science. So let me argue that we are, in fact, that Steve gave a wonderful history of the conflict of science and religion, but it isn't all ancient history. And there's lots of recent examples. This was an example in 2001 in Afghanistan, back when the Taliban were sort of our allies. This is a conflict between archaeology and religion. This is one of the famous Buddhas, which the Taliban destroyed. Beautiful, incredible, almost 2,000-year-old statues of incredible importance to civilization. But their religious belief at the time suggested that no likenesses of human beings should be portrayed. So they wanted to destroy all statues in Afghanistan. They didn't manage to do that, but unfortunately they did manage to destroy that. At the same time, in this country, there were conflicts, and this is one of my favorites. This was Tom DeLay from your state, Steve, who in fact has a degree in biology, which always amazes me, who put into the congressional record that the Columbine school shootings occurred in part, quote unquote, because our school systems teach our children that they're nothing but glorified apes who have evolutionized out of some primordial mud. Okay, this is the then House Majority Leader. This is a clear conflict between science and religion, and it is not theoretical in any way. It's very real, and I unfortunately have to waste a lot of my time on this very real conflict that's happening nowadays. And it's been here's some literature that by groups who have been against evolution. Was it? Yeah, this is the pointer. Great, thanks. So this is quite clear, right? And they're quite straightforward about it. In fact, I think Steve would argue that indeed this is. I don't know whether he'd argue that he's motivated by Satan so much, but or the sciences, but that in fact that evolution as part of science should aim at the bedrock of Christianity. And you see here that the point is that evolution is responsible, in this picture, for all of the sins of humanity, everything from awful humanism to divorce, euthanasia, homosexuality, pornography, abortion, racism, etc. And this really, for me, represents the problem of focusing on the conflict. Because I view why I, as a physicist, have gotten involved in this is kind of interesting. I view evolution as a straw man. It's really, this conflict that you see here is really based on a fear of science. A fear that in fact, Steve has argued in some sense is a real fear.
Okay, so it's working. I got it working.
But a fear that because science, in principle, not only potentially can replace God, but more importantly, I think, a fear of the fact that science doesn't explicitly mention God must mean, therefore, that science is immoral at its basis. And therefore, because it's immoral, it must be wrong. So because science doesn't explicitly include God, it must therefore be wrong. And it's an a priori argument, and therefore we have to change the way science is done. And evolution is just one example. The real goal in Kansas and other places, in Ohio, and in your state very soon, I guarantee you, because this is a well-funded effort, is to change the teaching of science itself. That science, which attempts to explain natural phenomena by natural effects by natural causes, is itself intrinsically wrong. That God has to be an explicit part of the equation. Now, let me talk about science enriching faith and quote one of my heroes. So Steve has said a number of things I like about science religion, but this is particularly important, I think. That science does not make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. And that's really important. Because, as he indicated, without science, everything is a special act. Everything is a miracle. When you have science, you suddenly can explain things based on natural causes. But it's the first sentence, I think, that's very important. And that, I think, is what we have to recognize. And where I will disagree strongly with several people, with Richard Dawkins, who will speak later. I think that, in fact, science does not make it impossible to believe in God, and we should recognize that fact and live with it. And, in fact, stop being so pompous about it. That for better or worse, science itself, the existence of science itself, cannot disprove the existence of God. But science itself can provide a paradigm and a prototype for understanding the world and dealing with problems of humanity that might. And the key example that I want to give is actually one I used from a New York Times piece I wrote, which actually caused Cardinal Schönborn to get so upset that he wrote in response, which amazed me because this was a piece where I argued that the Catholic Church was okay with evolution. And he got offended by that statement. But the example actually wasn't from evolution, it was from cosmology, and it involved Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest, who was one of the first people to actually understand that Einstein's general relativity predicted a Big Bang. Einstein didn't. Einstein thought the universe was static and eternal, and he derided, in fact, Lemaitre, as he did in many cases people who disagreed with him early on. The good aspect is that he eventually realized Lemaitre was right. But so when Lemaitre pointed this out, that one of the predictions of general relativity was that there was a beginning of the universe, Pope Pius at the time got very excited and wrote a public statement saying science had proved Genesis. Okay? Now, what did Lemaitre do? He was a priest at the time, and always was. He wrote to the Pope and said, stop saying that. Okay? And he said, you have no right to say that. You can take this, if you wish, to mean that science has proved Genesis to be correct, but you can also take it, this is a scientific theory, and it can be tested, and it stands on its own as science. What you take from it depends upon your metaphysical or religious background. You could take from it to be that it proves Genesis, or you could take from it to be that you don't need God at all, that the laws of physics will describe the universe right back to the beginning. What you take from it is your personal belief, and the science is independent of that belief. And I think that's very important, because the Big Bang is true whether or not you believe in God. Evolution happened whether or not you believe in God. And I think that what we should focus on, in fact, is ways that science can, in fact, if you wish, enrich faith by moving us, for some of us who are not people of faith, and I'm not, by moving us beyond faith. That science can be used as an example of how to understand the world in a good way, in a positive way, instead of a negative way. That science teaches us to oppose blind, unquestioning belief. As Steve said, there are no scientific authorities. There are scientific experts, but no scientific authorities. It can inform faith in lots of ways. In particular, it's very important that we don't respect all religious sensibilities. I think we need to respect people's philosophical notions in general, unless those notions are wrong. And what I mean and the great thing about science is that there's some things that are wrong. In fact, that's what makes science unique. Unambiguously, we can say what's wrong. We can't say what's right unambiguously, but we can say what's wrong unambiguously. And that's why we make progress. The Earth isn't 6,000 years old. It's wrong. If you have to believe that to believe in God, you better re-examine your belief in God. The sun didn't stand still in the sky in the Old Testament, but we can use it in other areas. I actually presented a slide at a meeting of a bunch of very faithful people, where it's kind of weird that I'm here for balance, because at that meeting I guess I was viewed as an extremist. But where I said homosexuality is not an abomination. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I can say science can inform religion in two ways. First of all, that homosexuality occurs naturally in various species. So it's certainly not an abomination in nature. But more importantly, science can say, well, if you believe that because of the fact that you're literally reading from the Old Testament, then you have to, it's all or nothing. Then you have to accept the fact that you're allowed to kill your children if they disobey you, or sell your wife into slavery if she's not particularly appropriate, or whatever.